Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. As I mentioned to Radwan, I still have copies of Muslim Democrat from early 2000, which was very much a founding institution which gave rise to CSID, as I recollect. And CSID has really come a long way after all of these years, and it's discharging an enormous civic obligation by keeping alive this discussion, especially now. And it's a real testament to the steady leadership of the organization for sticking to it. We need it. I have the unenviable task of speaking after these three very eloquent speakers. I was supposed to speak a little bit about challenges, and Dr. March does such a wonderful job talking about the theory of things. I do live here in Washington, so I'll say a little something about the policy side, as I have come to see it. As everybody has said, Tunisia is now widely hailed as the Arab Spring's only success story. And the dismal realities that we see elsewhere in the Middle East, I should say the soul-crushing realities, we're talking about the largest displacement of humanity since the end of World War II, makes Tunisia's efforts to form itself as a civic republic all the more impressive, and I would say heroic. And I emphasize that word heroic because Tunisia doesn't have to necessarily choose the path of civic republicanism. But I also use that word heroic because I think it is something that the United States, as another large and successful and old republic, needs to honor. And by honor, I mean that doesn't simply mean good speech, but it also means deep investment. It means coming up with a strategy. It means coming up with a policy that sees far, well into the future, and helps to create the conditions in which Tunisia's patriots from both Ennahda and Nida Tunis and from other parties have the security, the economic and political conditions in which they can build their republic and make it last. Our own republic, as Americans and everybody else here, there was a time when it wasn't quite clear if we would make it. But fortunately, we did have friends from France. The president of France was here just recently, and we had a lot of support from Lafayette and many others way back when. There was also a time when our founding president, in his farewell address, referred to the problems that our republic faced as one of the major threats that our republic faced when we were trying to form ourselves. And he described it as the insidious wiles of foreign influence. At the time, you will recall, we were a very fractious and factionalized polity, trying to figure out a way to form ourselves, trying to figure out a way to put ourselves together. And as it happened, we had a Hamiltonian faction and a French-loving Jeffersonian faction, which wanted to go at each other, couldn't find a way to talk to one another. And sure enough, by the 1790s, when a dispute begins to break out, which ultimately leads to the Napoleonic Wars, had we not had the far-sighted leadership of people like Washington and Adams and others to see farther and to see ourselves through and to choose a path of neutrality through that intra-European rivalry, we would not have had the political space in which to pull ourselves together and form a republic that has, in fact, lasted. I'm, in the broadest sense of the word, an American liberal. Of other liberals, I speak the language of rights. I speak the language of individual freedom, because I do think that by creating the conditions in which individuals have freedom, it produces all the great prosperities and the benefits and the capacity for moral improvement that we spoke about earlier. But we do ourselves as liberals a bit of a disservice by not speaking the older language of republics, and that is the language of sovereignty. That's the language of civic union. That's the language not just of human rights, but also of human obligation and of civic obligation to others. That language goes back to a deeper philosophical condition that understood that the heterogeneity of human society can't be escaped. We human beings cannot exit that reality. And the challenge of politics, I would say, is to try to figure out how to deal with that fundamental heterogeneity of societies. If societies attempt to subordinate or to suppress that heterogeneity, what ends up happening is you end up creating societies that don't succeed. You end up creating republics that fail. You end up creating tyrannies. You end up creating empires. You end up breeding resentments and violent faction, which ultimately proves the undoing of politics and makes politics impossible. I bring this up in part because, the heroism of the Tunisian Republic is really quite profound when you consider it against the backdrop of what is in fact happening in the Middle East today. As Radwan and many others, including myself, has argued, the US has a strategic interest in seeing the Tunisian Republic succeed because it shows that there's another way forward. But more fundamentally, it's not just the Tunisian Republic addresses the problem that Daesh and other terrorist groups pose. It's also that the Tunisian Republic is happening against an unprecedented political and ideological convulsion in the Middle East, in which the sources of anti-republicanism have been unleashed. And it's not just the Daesh or the so-called caliphate movement. It's also the anti-republicanism that we see in the Sisi government in Egypt. It's also the anti-republicanism that we see today in Turkey. I've written publicly, and I do believe that in 2016, we witnessed the fall of Turkey, the fall of the Turkish Republic. And I say that not with any sort of misplaced nostalgia for the old laicist Kemalist republic, which frankly I think had run out of gas in the 1970s. And it had only been until really the 2000s when Westerners began to take note of that reality. I'm not nostalgic for that, but I am nostalgic for the fact that Turkey had a whole series of institutions which had maintained the basic norms and had nourished the possibility for the many different peoples of Turkey, the different ethnicities, the different faiths, the different traditions, to at least begin to work out some of their differences and to come together and to maintain their union. I think Turkey today is much weaker off, and I'm sorry to say, I think it's much, much more insecure because of the path that it has gone down. And it's up for and I should also say that one of the bigger tragedies is Asia Minor, Turkey itself, has one of the largest concentrations of Republicans in the broadest sense of the world in the Middle East. And by that I mean not just Kemalist and liberal Republicans, but pious Muslims who understand that their life as citizens and as believers is much better off when not being ruled by an erratic and harsh authoritarianism. I think that fundamentally the strategic problem that America and all the friends of republicanism in the world need to try to address in the Middle East today is dealing with this larger crisis of governance that we're seeing. It is when you have a government that fails, that is what gives rise to the possibility for violent faction. That is what gives rise to the possibility for radicalism. And when you talk to people in Cairo, when you talk to people in Baghdad, when you talk to people in Sulaymaniyah or Erbil, everybody looks at Tunisia because right now Tunisia is showing a very different way forward than all of the other polities in the region. And for this reason, because I do think that the United States has a selfish, strategic, but also high and moral interest in seeing the Middle East become a livable place once again, we have a strategic interest in seeing the Tunisian Republic succeed. The Republic, as was mentioned, has established a democratic consensus. Yet democratic consolidation, by its very nature, requires a long-range effort. And right now, Tunisia is beset with massive security, governance, and economic challenges. We need to, from a practical perspective, address those. But I have to say that one of the things that's making the addressing of those challenges so complicated right now is more fundamentally a failure of politics. As we know, there is political deadlock in Tunisia. That political deadlock, particularly in the run-up to the municipal elections, is contributing to disputes within the parties and between the parties, which is making it very, very difficult to drive forward the deep structural reforms that Tunisia needs to consolidate its republic. Creating the institutions the institutions of civic republicanism, which allows a society as diverse as Tunisia to be able to deal with these problems, is going to take some time. The role I think that the United States can play in helping Tunisians do this is by creating the best possible circumstances for sovereignty, another key Republican term. And by sovereignty, we Americans, we do tend to, I think, interpret and understand sovereignty a bit in a limited fashion these days. Particularly, we tend to focus on the security side of things. And I will say, you know, the Tunisian military has acquitted itself in a very noble and decent fashion, particularly since 2011, and it's not using of violent force against Tunisian citizens. It is a partner, I think, for establishing and forming that republic, and it's a real asset, and I'm delighted to see that there's much, much deeper collaboration between the Tunisian military and the militaries of the United States and of Europe. But we also cannot neglect the political and the economic component, because without getting the politics and the economics right, sovereignty will not be nourished over time. A sovereign republic will not be established. Just as a practical matter, the economic side of things, you know, we talk a lot about IMF, among other things. Our Western tools, the European tools, which were invented after World War II, they're pretty good at helping to stabilize regimes. They're not very good at helping to stabilize countries. And we're quickly, I think, here in Washington, trying to figure out, particularly when we look at the instability in West Asia and in other parts of the world, trying to figure out what new practical tools we can develop to actually help people themselves, to give them the tools, the possibilities to help improve their situation. There is discussion even in this administration right now about not just reforming, but actually turning OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, into a larger body with more funds that can act in a country like Tunisia, where we have profound strategic interests, that can act to actually de-risk the situation from the perspective of American enterprise, to get involved in a country like Tunisia at a time when Tunisia is still working out the regulatory and legal environment that's required to actually attract foreign investment. These are the kinds of tools, this is the kind of thinking that we really need to avail ourselves of, and the kind of policies that we need. Beyond that, on the political side, I'll just go back to what President Washington had brought up, the insidious wiles of foreign influence. Tunisia is, on one level, it's very much deeply part of the Arab and the Islamic world, and it's also part of the Mediterranean world, and it's also part of the Society of Free Republics. Dealing with all of those different actors, those different polities around the world, and how they act on the Tunisian Republic and act on the polity itself, that's a really, really difficult thing to do, profoundly difficult thing to do. I think Americans, particularly from the viewpoint of us trying to establish a strategic compact with Tunisia, needs to appreciate just how deeply Tunisia is enmeshed in the larger struggles across the region. And we should develop a whole-of-region diplomacy with our allies and our protectorates, particularly in the GCC states, to make sure that we're not working against one another in such a way that contributes to dysfunction or contributes to an environment in Tunisia where the formation of Republican institutions is inhibited or indeed obstructed. So with that, there's so much to be honored in what Tunisia has accomplished. There's so much that's heroic there. The story needs to be told. And when the story is heard, I do think it will resonate with a large enough number of Republicans here in the United States, and that will hopefully step up and be the friend that Tunisia needs. So I'll end there.